everyone. Do you want to grab there are still a few seats, or you can sit around the sides and enjoy the canapes. Do come and sit down. There's Tony. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening, and welcome on behalf of the Policy Institute, King's Business School and Central London Forward. It's really lovely to see you all here. I'm Jenna Goldberg, your chair for the evening. I'm a partner and managing director of Insight at London Communications Agency. We're a comms consultancy that specialises in the built environment, and I recognise lots of you in the room from my work around London. Before I introduce proceedings tonight and our first two presenters, a couple of points of housekeeping. There are no fire drills expected, so if it goes off, it's real. We'll have a couple of presentations and then a panel discussion, and then there'll be a chance for all of you to ask questions and weigh in on the debate. And you can also tweet through the event using the hashtag #OutOfOfficeLDN. The reports are all available around the room, and they'll be sent out by email after the event. And appropriately enough, as well as everyone here tonight, the event is being streamed to an audience at home, and afterwards we can debate whether avoiding the rain was worth missing out on the canapes and the networking, and it's all very much on topic. As I noted, I represent clients from across the public and private sectors, whether they're developers, investors, public sector bodies, business improvement districts. And this is the question that everybody asks pretty much every day. What is the future of work, the future of workers, and how does that all relate to the future of London? So I'm really excited to get into that today. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking that probably more than social distancing or mask mandates or those daily press briefings we used to get, hybrid working is probably the single biggest and potentially the most permanent societal shift that the pandemic has wrought. Over the last 2.5 years, so many people, so many of us in this room, I'm sure, have become untethered from the office. For those of us who are lucky enough to be classed as knowledge workers, or maybe students, I'm sure some of whom are in the room, we've seen to some extent or other the link between work and office severed. And we can't forget those who haven't experienced this, of course. There's frontline workers and those in hospitality and service industries, manual labourers, construction workers, and many more. They haven't had the privilege, perhaps, of this shift, but they will certainly be feeling the impacts, as we all will. The impacts of it are completely seismic, not only to London and global cities, but everywhere, in economies everywhere. And of course, we're just at the beginning. We must remember that we were in lockdown less than a year ago. It was only January that we all went back home again for that sort of 3-week, that's strange, I think it was about 3 or 4 week period. So the research presented today is probably the first real look at a more settled state as we've come into what we can now maybe term some kind of business as usual. The first look away from the shock and disruptions of the pandemic itself. Those first few years were, wave after wave of crisis and being reactive, and we're now only just moving into that settled state as Londoners and the office market and the wider economy are adjusting to this new hybrid way of life. So that's enough from me, but I just wanted to set that context and to take us through this important research. We'll first hear from Bobby Duffy, Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and then Matthew Dillon, Director at Arup, to talk us through the two elements of this research today. So Bobby, please, over to you.
Thank you, Jenna. And just to manage expectations for the people in the room, these are King's canapes that you're going to be getting, so don't expect too much from them. You probably were better off at home with your own snacks, but hopefully the company and the discussion will make up for that. So I'm going to talk about a big program of research that we've done. It's partly sponsored by ESRC, partly sponsored by lots of people in this room, actually. And it had a whole series of elements to it, and in-depth interviews with business leaders, analytical reports, and then 2 major surveys of London workers, as we're calling them. That's people who have a London workplace, even if they're not necessarily working from there, so working hybrid. I'm going to focus mostly on that. And as you kind of guess from other sources, it's a big change, and as Jenna's introduction made clear, it's a big change in how we work. 2/3 of these London workers groups say they are hybrid working, and they're pretty damn happy with it. 81% of them say they're positive about hybrid, and they can see all sorts of clear benefits from it. So in terms of how they do their job, you've got many more hybrid workers compared to people who are working in the workplace, saying that they can do their job well compared to before COVID began. And even greater sense of freedom, greater differential sense of freedom for those who are doing hybrid work. 63% saying they've got more freedom in their role compared to before COVID began. But we looked into this in quite a lot more detail in different aspects in different parts of the study. And it's not so much the freedom measures as the practical benefits of working from home or in a hybrid way that people really emphasize. So it is true that if you force people into choosing which of them, these two views is closest to your view, the key reasons I'm positive about working from home are the freedom and control it gives me in my working life. You get a third of people saying that, but you get 2/3 of people nearly saying the key reasons I'm positive about working from home are practical benefits such as avoiding commuting or saving money. And this is an important aspect of how that's going to change over time. So there's been quite a lot of commentary about the cost of living crisis and how that's going to force people into the office to avoid having to heat their own home. But there's no sign of that in the responses from our London workers. Tony, are you saying, are you getting me to bounce or speak up? Okay, let me move this forward. Yeah, there's no sense that that's going to actually change people. Oh,
brilliant. We do have a mic. Oh, that's even better. That means I can come out here. So much better. Thank you. Yeah, so there's no sense that the cost of living crisis is going to change that in terms of bringing people back into the office, because the perception is very clearly that people are more likely to save more from home with all the commuting costs. One really interesting thing about this, and is a feature of all of this type of work in this space, is it really depends on the individual. And there's so many different circumstances for people. So young people are the most likely to say that both that the cost of coming into work is going to put them off and stay more at home. 66% of young people saying that, but they're also most likely to say the cost of staying at home will bring them in as well. So you've got 1 in 5 young people saying that that's more likely to bring them in. And that just shows young people will be living in different sorts of circumstances. So you will see more people coming into the office to make use of we were having this discussion in the briefing on this, to make use of the microwave, to make use of the heat, those types of things. But you'll also see more people staying at home too. And this, like I said, this is a recurrent theme in this as an area, that there are two sides or multiple sides to pros and cons of working from home, or this hybrid working, new hybrid working approach. And you can see that in terms of relationships with colleagues. So we asked people to what extent is it easier or harder to do working from home with working remotely with colleagues compared to working with them in person. And on the upside, it's easier to avoid awkward social interactions with colleagues, which is a benefit. One of the worst things about working is other people, clearly. So avoiding those sort of social interactions with colleagues seems a benefit for people. But then on the other hand, it's also difficult to establish a rapport and make those sorts of connections with people too. And in the middle, you've got this sense, greater sense that it's also easier to avoid conflict with colleagues. And again, that can be a good thing from a working practice point of view, but it also be a negative thing about not thrashing things out, working things through, or getting to those innovation that come from conflict. And that sense of development, these development opportunities as a team and for individuals, is one of the key things that we worry about people being more remote. And in particular, for young people, I think there is a sense of what is this going to mean for the development opportunities for younger colleagues? Is that going to hold them back? I think one of the most important bits of the research findings from the research was that that's not young people's perceptions at all on this. So we asked people, to what extent, if at all, do you think following things are easier or harder to do when working with colleagues remotely compared to working with them in person? Asking questions you're unsure about. Actually, young people are very positive about that. It's easier to do that remotely compared to the other age groups. Being honest with colleagues, similar sort of pattern, more positive sense, the democratizing sense of this technology being more important to young people, more visible as a benefit to young people, and even putting yourself forward for important tasks. This sense that young people are not going to get the opportunities because they're not around and so much is happenstance. That is not young people's perception from themselves. And even on establishing rapport, younger people more confident, not completely confident, but more confident than other age groups that is easier to do remotely. And then there's a really interesting question for future of development on this. Is this young people that not realising what they're missing out on because they haven't had those sorts of experiences, or are we trying to apply a very old model to how people develop over time, and what are the benefits of this different way of engaging with colleagues and getting to opportunities? And that variety is reflected in business leaders' views on this. And you've got very different perspectives on remote working. Elon Musk has a very particular perspective on remote working. Is no longer allowed unless you have a specific exception. This is assuming Twitter's still open and going. I haven't checked lately, but I think it is still open and going. So managers have to send the exception list for me to approve. And, you know, we may be questioning whether Elon Musk is quite the business genius that we thought he was before this, and it may turn out that he's absolutely right, but I think to take this approach in his particular sector with his particular workers, but it's very clear from our findings that that won't apply across the board, because you've got 3 in 4 workers say we are never returning to the old way of working, when most people come into the London workforce 5 or more days a week, and even 2/3 of people saying they would look for a new job if the employer made them follow that new working regime. So things have changed, and they're not going back. They may go back in particular sectors or at particular companies, but it's not going back across the piece. Politicians also getting in on this, and this was the release that we had out today about people's perceptions of politicians. This was Jacob Rees-Mogg's passive-aggressive note that he left on people's desks, which didn't go down well. Boris Johnson, obviously at the time as well, had a very florid view of his experience of working from home, where a lot of time is spent making another cup of coffee, then, you know, getting up, walking very slowly to the fridge, hacking off a small piece of cheese, then walking very slowly back to your laptop, then forgetting what it was you were doing, was Boris's view of that. But it's certainly, again, not London workers' view of what the realities of working, hybrid working and working from home is like, and then how acceptable that is for others to try to intervene in that. Politicians urging people to work more from home less, very unacceptable to people. You got 2/3 of people saying that is unacceptable, and even more people saying it's unacceptable, particularly completely unacceptable, politicians suggesting that people working from home are working less hard than those who don't work from home at all. So there is very clear from the surveys that we've done, people are working hard. They do think they're producing. They do think that their productivity is high, and it is actually a hard thing to do, that they're not slacking off. But and this is where some of these political statements and business leaders' statements get in the way of something that is actually more nuanced and has more sides to it and has more longer-term implications for productivity than this black or white, on or off type model kind of implies. And one of the reports that we got out, managed to get published just for today, is an update of this report on how will working from home impact productivity, which is like the key issue in many ways. And the reality is, from this literature review that colleagues Christian Escudero and Mark Kleinman, who's here tonight, has done, is that it's a very mixed picture of productivity impacts. There is no one clear suggestion on this. And perhaps the most important conclusion from that is we need to avoid those blanket conclusions that this is definitely going in one direction or another, consistently across different areas. And one of the challenges for this is unpicking the different sorts of effects, because the system clearly adapts to these major changes. So there was a doubling of patents related to working from home technology when the crisis first came in, because we adapt to those sorts of situations. So it's very difficult to unpick the true productivity impacts underneath this. And very clearly it will vary by sector, roles, location, and many other things. So blanket conclusions on this are very difficult. But in the end, there are reasons to be concerned about it for the economy overall, and then for particular places like London, particularly around things like agglomeration effects and the benefits that you get from those, and how that is going to change as we get much more spread out across things. So it's something to unpick carefully, not come to blanket conclusions on, and to engage people in a more grown-up discussion about what the pros and cons actually are. Final bit of data slide is that there's little consensus or even really strong perception of these broader effects among the workforce as a whole. People have not pieced these different things together. So when you ask people to what extent you agree or disagree that the quality of life in central London is at risk if people don't return to the workplaces at pre-pandemic levels, that's about as middling a finding as you can get. Some people say yes, a bit. Some people say no, not really. But no one really has a clear view of this among the workforce as a whole. We're not making those connections to the long-term impacts. And similarly, on the economy and jobs, whether remote working on a large scale is a risk to the future of jobs in London, no real strong view among London workers. It's probably pretty sensible at this point where we don't particularly know. But there is no strong sense of threat of the connection between those types of behaviours and what it means for place-based economies like London. So, sum up for me, it is, I think what the research shows is a whole range of visible and less visible benefits and risks to people. And what is very clear is the individual benefits and control, freedom, and the practical positives that you get from this type of hybrid working, alongside this little sense of threat to development at an individual level, our own career development, or innovation among workers as a whole right now. And then related to that, any impact on productivity, agglomeration, or sustainability of a city's offer. No real clear view among the workforce on those types of things. Or, as mentioned in Jenna's introduction, what that means for any sense of deepening divides between those who have the flexibility and the beneficiaries of that and those who may be negatively impacted by these broader effects. There's no real sense of that among that worker opinion. So, the key conclusion for this, and this is an ongoing range of work that we'll be doing and unpicking more in other studies, is you need to look at it as a whole because it's so interconnected in different sorts of ways. You can't separate bits off and just look at them individually and expect to come to the right sort of conclusions. But in that, we need to keep flexibility in our responses, not being dogmatic about things having to be a particular way. Think about possible futures, and I know the Arup work that we're going to hear about next from Matt does take that more scenario-based approach about what will happen and how will you adapt in different sorts of futures. But the key lesson is we're not going back, and we shouldn't try to go back. We should be trying to take the best from both, and that's the key task for sessions like this. Thank you.
Thanks, Bobby. Hi, everyone. Is that working okay? Cool. Thank you very much, Jenna and Bobby. My name's Matt Dillon. I'm a director at Arup, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our work alongside Gerald Eve and the London School of Economics on the future of office work in central London. And our study differs a little bit from Bobby's. We made use of data sources that were publicly available, as well as some scenario testing, and we actually focused on office sectors and office workers only, rather than the whole of London's workers. And our study was in two parts. So the first part was really understanding what's going on right now. How often are people coming back? How are they behaving in terms of the tasks that they do? And then the second part was looking at what might happen in future. So those scenarios that Bobby was talking about, looking at how those might play out over 15 or 20 years. But first of all, a couple of slides on why this is so important. So there are a huge number of office workers in central London. There's around 750,000 in the City and Westminster alone. And on the map in front of you, you can see the blue is a higher concentration of workers and the red is a lower concentration of workers. But the numbers do drop off significantly the further from the centre that we go. And when we get out to Haringey, Lambeth and Lewisham, for example, we've got office workers numbering in the low tens of thousands. So that's as low as 1/40th of the number that are crammed into the city very densely there in the middle of the screen. And then it's also worth thinking about the context of the last few years. That makes together there are around about 1.5 million office workers in central London in 2019, and that's almost all of the office jobs in the capital. And it's remarkable that this number increased by around 400,000 between 2009 and 2019. So that's up from just over 1 million to 1.5 million in 10 years. And because these are a wide variety of jobs, but they tend to be good jobs in industries like finance, like the civil service, like law, like the creative sectors, that growth in office jobs has almost single-handedly driven the 29% increase in London's GVA over that same time period. So right now is a very, very interesting time. And it was very interesting, as Bobby mentioned, doing these studies as the world out there was evolving. We've actually gone beyond what's on that graph, and I checked this morning, and tube ridership is around about 75 or 85% of 2019 levels now. So it's slightly ahead of what's on the chart. Office attendance is just below 50% of 2019 levels. But because offices were never 100% full in 2019, that means if we were to turn up at the average central London office this week, knock on the door and have a count of how many people were at their desks, we'd probably see around about 35 or 40% of desks that would be occupied. And the time that people attend offices and the days of the week that people attend offices has also changed. There was always a midweek peak, which is represented by London Underground's ridership before the pandemic by the dotted line. And then the solid lines are various estimates of the midweek peak in 2022. And you can see that the midweek peak has become more peaky. Thursday is the busiest day of the week, and Friday is now by far the quietest day of the week, with around about 50% of Thursday's attendance levels. And that lack of spread outness throughout the week has huge implications for office providers, for providers of transport like TfL, and for people trying to build business cases for infrastructure. But hybrid working and these new patterns of working I endorse Bobby's closing statement here, really can deliver the best of both worlds if they're done well. At office working, we have people that benefit from more social contact. We have water cooler conversations. We have agglomeration and spillovers into industries that might locate nearby our offices. And remote working saves the time and cost of commuting. Remote working is more compatible with caring responsibilities. And together, those two factors mean that London could benefit from a wider labour market capture from hybrid working, both in terms of diversity and in terms of geographical location. But in order to realise these benefits, we do need to get better at compartmentalising our tasks. We need to get better at dealing with those in-person tasks on days in which people are in the office, and doing those tasks that are best performed solo whilst we're at home. In many cases, this requires infrastructure or systems on behalf of employers, such as investing in team days, investing in desk booking systems that allow teams to locate next to one another, and indeed a degree of understanding across suppliers and clients within the same industry. And actually, there are signs that the office market out there is returning to normal levels. So in a typical quarter, take-up rates of office space are around about 300,000 square meters in central London. That's been true for the last 10 years, although it dropped off substantially during the pandemic. And you can see that the last 3 or 4 quarters have been performing at that level, largely sustained by a solid performance both in the city and the West End. But availability rates are currently high, and there has been an increase in subletting. And subletting is whereby an office tenant that hasn't reached the end of their agreement might not need the space anymore, and so look to let it on to other potential tenants. And we've seen a big increase in that in the last few months. And actually, these broad trends across the whole of the office market can be further elaborated on by looking at a real polarization within the market itself, and the flight to quality, which I think has been well documented, which is this trend for people looking for more plush offices, higher quality offices, often more centrally located, is shown on this chart here. And you can see that whereas the best quality offices, the prime offices, are now very close in pricing terms to their pre-pandemic level, secondary offices are around about 10% down in terms of their price, and if anything, are decreasing further. And this flight to quality is driven by a number of factors. So there's a desire for low carbon offices in line with organizations and employers wanting to get down to net zero. We've actually seen higher growth since the pandemic in industries and sectors that really value the most prestigious offices. And more broadly, the office market is being sustained by pent-up demand from the COVID period, and also by pretty low levels of supply. And if we look at how the flight to quality might play out geographically, again, we've got a very interesting pattern here. So in the city, in the West End, around about 70 or 80% of the offices are the highest quality. That's 3 stars or above. But out in more peripheral locations, so if we get to the northern parts of Camden, northern parts of Islington and Hackney, and the southern parts of Wandsworth, Lambeth and Southwark and Lewisham, they've only got around 20% of offices at the highest quality. And so seeing how this spreads out geographically is going to reveal some very, very interesting patterns going forward. So what are providers looking for? Well, they're looking for high quality sustainability credentials. They're looking for a range of tasks to be performed in the office. So that's quiet spaces for phone calls and working, as well as an abundance of meeting spaces and places for collaboration. They're looking for good access to public transportation, so centrally located offices. They're looking for food and beverage amenities, so that includes both on-site and off-site, with vibrancy and the offer outside the office door being even more important. And they're also looking for a design which embodies the organization's brand and values. And so we put some of this together and looked at what might happen in future. We devised 3 scenarios, which are hopefully taking place on the screen in front of you. The midweek metro assumes that that midweek peak remains. Now, this has implications for how much space is needed by employers. We also assume that employers are successful in enticing around about 65% of people back, so that's 65% of 2019's levels of attendance. Back to the office, that scenario relied on a huge effort by employers to bring people back to around about 4/5 of 2019 levels, and also had the 2019 balance of spread across the week. Uniform utilization assumed that people would come in around about half of 2019 levels, but that employers put a lot of effort into spreading that load throughout the week. So that's enticing people into the office with cake, with other foodstuffs, or potentially more stringent means, such as we've seen some employers suggest. And there we go. Okay, and we're seeing how the scenarios play out on the chart in front. Midweek metro and back to the office, broadly speaking, return to 2019 levels of inhabited floor space by the early 2030s. Uniform utilization takes a lot longer to recover and only recovers by 2041. In all scenarios, we do have an inertia that's caused by the long lease arrangements that many providers are in at the moment, many employers are in at the moment. And we've also assumed long-term jobs growth in these sectors, and the supply of office space in some cases is actually suppressing return to those 2019 levels. So the wider economy can have a real impact on demand as well as employee attendance rates. And so the prospect of a recession in 2023 is a real threat to these figures. And of course, office workers have a significant impact on the local economy as well. And here we've charted the pre-pandemic office worker spend alongside that from locals and tourists. And the office worker spend is the blue bar towards the top of each of these bars for each borough. And if we take Westminster as an example, you can see there's a very large blue bar with office workers representing almost £1 billion of spend per annum. However, they do represent a relatively low proportion of the total, so around about 8% in Westminster. And actually, in all of the central London boroughs, bar the city, office workers represent 10% or below of the total spend. So there's a lot of them, but office workers tend to spend less than tourists and other visitors. The city stands alone in this respect, and actually the city relies on office workers for around about 43% of its local spend. So very significant there. And however, of course, there are benefits to more residential areas from office workers working at home. And it's no surprise that Pret in more suburban areas are showing transaction levels that are now 20% higher than the pre-pandemic peak, which is represented by the red line at the top of the chart. But actually, it's more notable, perhaps, that the West End and City Prets are nearly at 90% of their pre-pandemic values. And so that's a much greater value than the population of office workers and their attendance rates would suggest. And actually, there's a growing body of evidence now from credit card spend, from the hospitality industry, from the leisure industry, that office workers are spending more on each visit to central London, and they're also timing their visits to the office to align with social occasions and visits to cultural venues. So the impact on the wider face-to-face sectors is being mitigated by people spending more and even splurging on lunch. So, recommendations. Our first one is that we're suggesting that central London's office stock needs to meet market needs. So that means, on the one hand, protecting important commercial properties in some areas, but potentially supporting a managed transition of less viable properties, particularly in peripheral areas, to other uses where appropriate. And that does include conversion to residential. We're also suggesting that there needs to be an affordable and reliable public transport network to make best use of these benefits from wider labour market capture, and also to remove cost barriers to people that would like to go into the office but are prevented from doing so by the high costs that Bobby talked about. We're suggesting a more efficient use of office stock, and there's a potential role for the public sector or other matchmakers here to really marry up those office providers that have an abundance of space with those that might want to use the space. And that could be startups, it could be community groups, it could be local schools or other opportunities. And then perhaps lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we want to see a protection and enhancements of the wider ecosystem around offices. The key to London's success going forward, both in an economic sense and in a well-being sense, is the wider cultural creativity and public realm offer. And we really see that wraparound offer, which is increasingly important to people's visits to the office, being a key part of London's recovery going forward. And it's essential to safeguard that, to make London continue to be a great place to work, to live, and to do business. And that's the end of the presentation. Back to you, Jenna.
Thank you very much. Can I invite our panellists to come up and join me on the stage? And doesn't speak well of my chairing that we're already well behind time, so I'm going to ask you to gather your thoughts quickly so that we can dive into the discussion. I'm going to let you all introduce yourselves as we move across the panel to just reflect on the research that we've just heard. So, Munya, can I start with you?
Yeah, so I'm Munya Brewer. I'm the Deputy CEO for Business London. Shall I give you my reflections as well?
Please do.
So for those of you that don't know Business London, we were the artist formerly known as London First. We're a business membership group. We have a mission to make London the best place in the world to do business, and that's very much working with and for the whole of the UK. So I'm just going to give a few thoughts on some of the issues raised by the presentation. I'll highlight some work that we're doing that I think is relevant to this, and some brief thoughts on some of the changes that we might need to see to public policy. So in response to the presentations, I think the flight to quality is something that members have been telling us for some time. And it was a point highlighted in some research that we did with CBRE quite recently, looking at commercial property. And what we found was evidence of a two-speed market emerging. And, as the presentation pointed out, Grade A office space is very much in demand as firms are looking to find the right space to support hybrid working and also to sort of burnish their ESG credentials. And there's a clear focus on issues like well-being. Landlords are pulling out the stops, providing their tenants with more services, and the days of sort of let and forget are long gone, it would seem. And of course, that means there is a risk that's been highlighted that you end up with swathes of secondary office space that may become obsolete, and particularly where the cost of upgrading a building to meet new sustainability requirements is high. And looking at things like the TfL data that Matt shared and West End data on footfall, it's clear that we're not at pre-pandemic levels. Weekends, the TfL data does show, are very strong. So leisure has bounced back very strongly at the weekend, and businesses during the working week are trying to lure staff back. I think it's more carrots than sticks. So cake, football are some of the things that they're trying, and but some are being slightly more prescriptive about the number of days you need to be in. Some are saying come in on a Monday or Friday, or team meetings. Often it tends to be quite client-led. But what I would say is that there's considerable variation in what businesses are doing. And I think there are, for every firm in London, there's a firm-level decision that's taking place. And it's really difficult, as Bobby pointed out, to draw sort of firm conclusions on the impact of hybrid working. And, as Jenna said, there are many people that don't have the luxury of working from home. So I'm just going to touch on our Place Commission briefly, which is looking at some of these issues, and it's at quite an early stage. What we've done is we've brought together 20 senior business leaders to look at how London's built environment needs to evolve post-pandemic. And it's a bit too early for me to share conclusions from that work, which is due out in the spring, but some of the things that are emerging from those discussions are issues around the importance of common ownership, and also finding a place's purpose and being really clear about that. Supporting new uses, delivering better public realm, focusing on digital as well as physical infrastructure are all key themes that are emerging, and that research will be out in the spring. And then just finally, what would help sort of shift the dynamic and attract people back? Well, there's a really big issue around rail fares. So we'd like to see that some fundamental reforms there, because the current model of peak time fares and season tickets clearly is not working anymore. Second, we need to market London really well. And I think the Mayor's Let's Do London campaign is a really good example of effective destination marketing. And I think there were some stats out earlier this week that showed for every £1 spent, it generated another £28 in ROI. And we should look at broader marketing initiatives. So if Monday and Friday are a problem, can we see more sort of joined up initiatives to encourage people back with hospitality and fares? We've not seen anything like that emerge yet. And also, we want to get tourism numbers back up. So one of the things that was briefly on the table under the Truss government and then was whipped away was tax-free shopping. And we've written to the Prime Minister to ask that the OBR carries out an independent review of the benefits, because that would provide a really big boost to London and get people back. And my final point is about skills. Getting Londoners into the jobs that are currently available is really key, because getting more people into jobs means more people into London, more spending, and hybrid working, if done right, has the potential to open up the labour market and could play a really important role in labour market inclusion and social mobility.
Thank you, Munia. Over to you, Paula.
Hi, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to follow that, if I'm brutally honest. Paula Walsh, I'm a fellow director of MAT at Arup. and I lead our business in London. And I suppose just picking up on some of the points that both Matt and Bobby made, hybrid working, we were, I firmly believe, on a trajectory towards that before the pandemic happened. And I think what the pandemic has done is just kind of speed that up. It was a sort of almost like a shock to the system, to business, to us all. And we had to react. And I think generally business amazingly did react hugely positively to that shock. But now we've come out the back end of it, and it's a case of how do we turn that shock into kind of like a new reality? And there's not one answer, I think, and I think you could see that from the information that was shown on the slides. So there isn't one answer. And it's really about creating that relationship between employer and employee in the organisation you happen to be part of, and go on that journey together. And I don't think it's a fixed journey either. So what might be an answer today might not be the answer tomorrow or in a year's time or 5 years' time. So I think suddenly we're entering, again, some of the research was showing this, a new period of time where it's a partnership that the employer and the employee are creating and going on a path with to actually create that new workplace and what that new aspiration is. So that's one observation. And then I think the second one, which sort of builds on it a little bit more, is about relationships. And I'm thinking more of the workplace ones rather than your sort of social life, but I think the two things are very similar. And so I think we've created relationships in the past, both within our organisations and externally, through people, face-to-face connections, because we're quite social beings. We're all here as social people wanting to interact with each other. And that's how business has been done. And to be honest, particularly when you look at the office, that's what we're all here for, is about business. So if you sort of go down a hybrid route, where does relationship forming happen? Are we in a face-to-face scenario or are we not? How do we then build new relationships as well as continue to develop the existing ones? And one of the biggest observations that I had from colleagues during the pandemic was it was really hard to create new relationships because we were using the old forms of relationship building, which is people-to-people contact, and that wasn't available anymore. So, moving forward, taking on board a more hybrid type of working, how do you form relationships? How do you continue to build on them and create that success, which is not only a business external success, but also an internal success of your organisation. If you can't create the culture and ethos of your organisation internally, then how successful are you going to be? And I think the key thing for me was that I have been used to creating relationships by people interaction. Somebody considerably younger than myself, who might have grown up during the pandemic or through the IT revolution, might think about creating relationships in a whole different way. There's no right way or wrong way, but how do you bring the both of those together and blend it to make it successful for how you form relationships in your organisation to be successful as a business?
Thank you, Paula. Over to you, Charles.
Charles Begley. I'm the Chief Executive of the London Property Alliance, which is the umbrella group name for two property associations, the City Property Association and Westminster Property Association, covering those areas. But obviously we're incredibly interested in the entire central activity zone, including your area, Kieran, Southwark, Norfolk Borough. So yeah, I'll start off, far from being the death of the office, and our focus really is on, commercial offices as a membership body representing the owners, investors and developers primarily. The hybrid working has led to an increase in the demand for best-in-class office space, as Matt touched on earlier. And in the West End, we've seen prices in Q2 for Grade A, the very best office space you can get, rising by 15%, and in the city, 11%. So there are, and that demand is driven by that need for sustainable, collaborative place, a place where you can embody your kind of corporate culture, where creativity can be engendered, and people just, like Paula said, people are social animals. It's not a binary choice: work from home, work from the office. That hybrid working is here to stay. The genie's out the bottle. I think the issue for city centres, and particularly Central London Forwards area, is how these urban centres respond, because it's not without risks. I think the office market is incredibly strong and incredibly resilient, at the best in class. But secondary office stock we have seen is actually falling through the floor. What do we do with that type of stock? I think longer term projections around employment I thought really interesting. The Matt's figures about 400,000 increase in jobs over the decade 2009 to 2019 was absolutely fascinating, because actually in Westminster during that same period there was only a 1% increase in office space, and in the city 11%. And I know there's Hackney and Islington saw huge rises of 33% and 18% respectively, in Southwark as well. But some of those areas started from a relatively low base, and the city and Westminster have huge amounts of office stock. But that huge increase in office workers was led by really downsizing in office space, in requirements per person. 2018, it was getting, some offices were packing them in like battery hens of 8 square metres per person per worker. The British Council's offices last month put out new guidance. It should be between 10 and 12%. I'd suspect that may actually go even further. Over a decade ago, it was nearly 15 square metres per person in some instances. So that quality of office space. So whilst how office space is used, that demand for best in class is increasing. The availability of stock is very low, and actually, as I think Matt said, recession will actually limit investment in that area, increasing demand. And actually packing workers in like sardines is something that any good employer is going to be very reluctant to do, simply because they want to encourage their staff into the office. And the final point is not just about how offices respond, but those city centres and our civic leaders, how they respond. So there's a real demand to make those areas increasingly open, accessible, fun, vibrant, and appeal to your workforce and visitors. So at those soft visiting times of the end of the weeks, make sure you're attracting enough non-office workers into your areas. And I think this is embodied really by the city's flagship campaign at the moment, Destination City. It obviously has seen the stats, it understands what's going on in its area, and it has a big job to do to convince more people to visit it. It's a fabulous place when you go in to visit and explore it, but it can be quite hard to navigate. Places aren't as welcoming and large as they could be, and this is a reason why in the West End there are very huge concerns around Oxford Street and its future. For the very same reasons, no one can take that for granted. So I think great opportunity, huge risks, but respond right. I think we can be confident for Central London.
Thank you, Charles. Bobby, I'm going to skip over you, I hope you don't mind, and ask Councillor Kieran Williams to introduce himself and say a few words.
Thank you. So I'm Councillor Kieran Williams, Leader of Southwark Council, also Chair of Central London Forward. And I suppose I start by saying it's fantastic to see the resilience of London that was in the presentations today. So whatever else you take away from this, you're seeing predictions that we get back to office use and office work in the centre of our city that is above pre-pandemic levels, and that's the direction we're heading. Now, a recession might take us longer to get there, and let's all hope that that recession that we're now in is short and shallow, but the ability to bounce back is there. And so I think another really important message that comes out of this is we need to hold on, one way or another, to these spaces for commercial use. Because if we lose them, and in particular if we lose them to housing, which is one of the things that had been floated, you can't get something back once it's someone's home. It's not going to come back into being office use, and we're going to cut off the ability of our city to thrive in the future and for the economy to grow. What we do know, though, very firmly, and going back to the presentations, is that getting people back into the centre of London isn't just about jobs. It's about it being a quality place, and that's perhaps the most important thing. And when people are making their day-to-day choices, and I have conversations with people about this all the time, shall I go into the office, shall I work at home? Increasingly, that's a choice that's not just about the job, and yes, it's about the quality of the work environment and what my employer's doing, and are they being nice to me and encouraging me in, or using a stick. But it's also about what's the cultural offer, what can I do after work with my friends and my colleagues, and it's about the quality of the environment around them as well. And so getting people back into the city, into the centre of our city, requires investment in those things too. I think the Mayor's Let's Do London campaign is a fantastic example of the promotion, but we also need the investment in the fabric of the city centre. Now, you won't be no surprise for all of you to hear me as the leader of a local authority saying we face a huge squeeze on our budgets right now to invest in exactly those things, the things that make our streets safe, high quality. And so securing this long-term future is a role for employers and property owners, but it's a role for us collectively together, and we need to secure that investment so we can make the centre of London a great place to be in, as it is in many ways, that people want to be in. I suppose the last thing I want to say is just about seizing some of the opportunities here, recognising there are a lot of risks here and that nothing is certain. But actually one of the real challenges we've faced over the last decade is the centre of our city has been unaffordable for people who are starting out a business, unaffordable for many organisations that are doing really positive contributing work, but aren't bringing in the big money that finance or legal firms bring in. And so there's absolutely an opportunity to think about how we can use space that's being underutilised now over the next decade to allow the future companies to start, to allow them to get a foot on the ladder and make their way into the future. So it is a real challenge right now. It's a real practical challenge for things like Transport for London's budget, who simply don't have the fares that they would once had. But actually, there's a real chance to be optimistic for the long term and think about how we secure that accommodation in the short term.
Thank you, and that picks up on a point that I wanted to make before we throw things open to the floor. So please do think of your questions and be confident in raising your hand. But just in listening to all of this, and particularly to the research, this feels like a space that is absolutely ripe for disruption. We talk about disruption often in tech, and that's certainly tech is going to play its role here, but also I think in transport, in the way that TfL structures its services, in our places, and how we shape them, and the kind of the breadth of the offer that our places put together. And lots of you in this room are placemakers, and we'll be thinking about that. But also I'm struck by the number of times that both Bobby and Matt sort of mentioned the long lease model in office spaces, and whether that is something that we think is ripe for disruption. I'm sure it is already, people are already thinking that. And we do have these sort of third spaces that are popping up. I think there is even a brand called Third Space that are not quite home, not quite the office, and also shared spaces like WeWork. So I just wonder sort of, perhaps, Paula, from your perspective, from a kind of private sector perspective and someone who studies the office market, whether there are kind of new entrants here that you think might change the game a bit.
Yes, because I think the office market particularly, and the people who operate in that office market, are very resilient, and they're very good at finding alternate use when it's almost like, okay, that's not quite working, how do we flex in one way or another? WeWork was a prime example for it, and so I think there is a lot of resilience, a lot of good minds. And I think that whole piece which Matt mentioned, I think it was, about the fact that everything looks let, but actually when you go and open the doors, it's not. And that whole second letting, and Arup, we've done exactly that. We've sublet one of the floors in 80 Charlotte Street that we had already taken. We knew we weren't going to occupy it, so we immediately looked around to who to sublet to. So that's, and there will be more and more of that. And I think, the AFLs that the organisations will agree with landlords will have to change to be more accommodating of those types of evolution that will happen So yes, I think it's very resilient, creative. Charles will have
And,
a
and,
view as
well,
well. Let's get back to you.
the landlords themselves, the owners themselves already entering that market. Workplace hugely disrupted it and transformed the market. I think it's like 1 million square feet in the city alone of, WeWork. But the landlords have seen of that model, and actually those old sort of very transactional kind of owner and occupier relationships have changed. It's become, properties become more like a service. You look at offices, the lobbies of offices, they feel like hotels. There's lots of shared space. It's very, very different. Even in 10 years, it's radically changed. It was already changing. And I think the pandemic has just accelerated it.
Definitely. I'd like to open that up to the floor for questions rather than selfishly ask lots of my own. Yes, at the back.
I have seen the different world. What really concerns me, people are employed on a different level of experience. Now, if you have been with a company for quite a long time, you know how certain, you know what to look forward, maybe one thing, but not inexperienced, but unconfident people starting, they suddenly have to work from home. It's an office, they can knock door, next door and ask what they call it, you need some help. You can't keep on calling up your boss 5 times a day because you're stuck again. It goes against you. The other thing is also a psychological problem. The couples working at home, both of them, maybe some kids running around as well, different which ages. And, I think the divorce percentage will go up because one starts getting on each other's nerves, being at home all the time. And the third thing is when you look around, I'm not speaking about this, I don't know anybody there, people put on weight because working at home, so we quickly go to the kitchen and go over the biscuit tin or a bar of chocolate because one is stressed and one hasn't got any release of the stress. What does one do? One eats or drinks. So I think it has pro and against, but one also has to take this issue in that, yes, it's ideal. I don't have to go by tube, by train anymore. I'm at home. I can work in my pajamas. So it's fine for 2-3 months. But, you have to get rest at one point and not just to go down to the pub.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point, Bobby. Maybe you can pick up on that. I think, as somebody who did put on weight in lockdown and also was looking desperately to find places to avoid my children being under my feet, I think that is a really important point actually about mental health, but also about the kind of wider behavioural impacts of this new way of working. And I know that's something that your research did pick up on, but we're focusing on the office and workers today, but presumably you also looked at the kind of wider behavioural changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And throughout the pandemic, a whole series of studies about the impact of that on people, and there was some real impacts on physical and mental health from that type of experience, and you shouldn't downplay that at all. I think that the thing that comes through in this, now that we're more in this more settled state of hybrid working, is that yes, there's still those disadvantages, but on average, looking across the piece, people think that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks, those sorts of drawbacks now that we're in this. But that won't be the same for everyone, and it will put pressures on those who are more vulnerable. And that has been the theme of the pandemic from the beginning, is it exposes vulnerabilities and plays on them, which could be relationships, could be health-related, mental or physical health. So it's going to be is a disparity of effects on different people. It's not at all uniform. But if you look at the average, it still is a net benefit in people's perceptions of how they are now balancing work and home. And that, again, not to say that people don't find it hard to switch off, and all of those types of effects of that boundary between work and home is putting pressure on some people, and people are finding that quite difficult. I think the developmental point is a really, really interesting one. We've got some great colleagues from the business school here who focus on this and maybe get into that when we do discussions around drinks and things, because it's that there is something really interesting about how is that model of development going to change, and the extent to which people are going to take up opportunities in different sorts of ways that aren't just about osmosis and observation and happenstance of being in the right place at the right time, but in different sorts of ways. And I think it's right for us, I think, to be worried about developmental opportunities, but it's also right for us to think that there isn't just one model for that, and that younger people, younger generations that have grown up, as other contributors said, with different types of ways of interacting and putting yourself forward, are probably better placed to take advantage of those, and we should be listening to those people as well as thinking about the models that we are used to. So I think there's opportunities there too, and the whole thing is like a massive natural experiment of different types of approaches that are going on, are going to be more successful or unsuccessful, and we need to be looking for those signals of what's working and what isn't, and that's going to be the crucial thing.
Agree, and I think it would be interesting to have a set of digital natives that younger generation design that training and development program for themselves. Sorry, lots of questions coming in. I'm going to go to Alex at the back there, and then I'll come over to the front.
Alex Jan, work with a number of the bids and also with Charles at London Property Lines. I guess I don't want to break up the party here, but I guess an observation, if I may, and then a question. The transition that we've seen in terms of home working, hybrid working, was an accidental consequence of a public health emergency. So nobody was doing the analysis and willing upon employers and others this big shift to hybrid working. In fact, for the last 30 years, policy was going in exactly the opposite direction. So Crossrail has just celebrated 6 months of running today. A good chunk of Crossrail's business case is based on what was called these agglomeration economies, which come from deep and wide access to labour, spillover benefits, innovation, and so on. And interestingly, agglomeration benefits occur over and above the firm level. So the only agent really for agglomeration benefits should be business organisations and indeed government who are interested in productivity and competitiveness. And London has just gone through a 10-year period of productivity flatlining. There are no indications that that is going to change. If anything, I think the money will be on it declining. So my question is this: do you think employees who work at home will find it acceptable when their wages start to fall? Because that's the natural consequence of the loss of agglomeration. Their wages are higher at the moment because they are in this super productive part of the economy, 11% of output in 1,000th of the country's landmass. But when the equilibrium resets itself, their wages will fall. And I wonder if their survey responses to the King's work will be different, if indeed, when that happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Not sure who on the panel would like to answer that very direct question, Bobby.
It's a great question. So I will go first, but I'll just say, really interested in the other panelists' views. The reason I go first is I've just come off chairing the Academy of Social Science annual lecture from Torsten Bell about the impact of the lack of growth and productivity, or lack of economic growth and lack of productivity growth in the UK as a whole, and the extent to which London has done better than lots of other parts of the country, but all of these pressures are moving against it. So I think Alex's point is exactly the right one. Is our real issue is one of economic growth and of productivity growth in order to achieve that economic growth. So in all of this work, we should be focusing on what is the productivity impacts from agglomeration or for other types of things, because that is not a removed macroeconomic question. That is exactly the sorts of real world impacts that is going to make a difference to people as real wages do actually fall further in what is going to be a terrible, terrible couple of years that London is not going to be immune from. And how we come out of that should be the focus of this, should absolutely be the focus of what we're trying to understand, not just what it feels like in the short term, and not just what employees think and workers think about that now, but how does that relate to this huge productivity challenge that we've got?
Minya, I wonder, thinking about your members, would they like to see an equivalent to the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, that is work out to help out, get to the office to help out the economy?
I think Alex is right that we do need to understand the interaction between all those individual firm level decisions that are taken by businesses for their own good reasons, because it works for their firms and their employees, and the impact that has on the wider London economy as a whole. Would we want to see... I think that's really challenging, Jenna, because the last time that was tried, it backfired so spectacularly. that I think where businesses are at the moment in a tight labour market and where employee engagement is so important, that they are still in the more encouraging rather than being really prescriptive. Now, does that change in a recession? Maybe. I think there are a couple of challenges around the spotting when the agglomeration is really under threat. One is spotting exactly when it's happening and when you need to act, because the impact wouldn't be an event, it's a process, and we're still in the middle of that process. So it might be hard to then determine when it's too late to act. And then the other challenge, I think, is around motivating collective action, because businesses at the moment are focused on what matters to their business and what enables them to retain their staff. So trying to make that link and change individual business behaviour to think more about the long term and slightly in the abstract, I think is a real challenge.
Kieran.
I suppose I'd slightly challenge the premise of the question. So clearly we're still all trying to work out whether hybrid working is more or less productive. There is a lot of work still going on that. But I think we also need to step back and understand why is it that London and Britain have had flatlining productivity, flatlining GDP per person, and I'd argue strongly that's about underinvestment. It's under private and public investment, underinvestment in education, particularly vocational education, underinvestment in research and development, underinvestment in infrastructure, and underinvestment in the quality of our places, and that's the thing that's holding us back. Now, there might or might not be a marginal impact of hybrid working on that, but I don't think it's the thing that's going to lead to workers having lower or higher wages ultimately. We need that bigger national approach and strategy to invest in the things that's going to drive up productivity.
Probably a final point to add on, employers, due to hybrid working, actually have a larger labour pool to choose from, way beyond the 5-day commuter belt. But even further, if it's a 3-day commuter belt, which actually that means more competition for jobs. So in return of that, I would have thought competition is the biggest impact, has the biggest impact on salaries.
Lady down at the front.
Hi, I'm Zafia. I'm from the Institute for Employment Studies. Really interesting information and presentation today, and really support some of our work that we did in our work after lockdown research. One of the things that I feel is really important here is the role of management. And when you were talking about GDP and why we haven't developed as much as we have to other countries, is our underinvestment in management here. And one of our major research findings was the impact of the hybrid working on management, and management really struggling to find that sweet spot between what is good for the organisation, the individual, and the team in which people work. And also the people, individuals who managed direct reports had worse well-being than those who didn't manage, because of the extra pressure they were on having to manage the hybrid work situation. So one of my questions is, what are we doing about the lack of training, investment in management? Not it's a London thing, but it's a more UK-wide thing. But that's something that really is key. I think added to that, an overarching question for me comes for this is, going forward, what is the purpose of an office? Because we don't want to be encouraging people to come to the office and effectively having hybridism, where people come to the office where they're just in Teams meetings all day and not actually investing in the social connectedness of an office. So what actually do we want an office to be? And therefore, once organisations have established that question, would that be able then to help how they manage hybrid working going forward? And my third point is, do we need to change about what we call productivity? Because there's lots of talk about GDP performance per hour. Do we now have to think about, and what hybrid work is showing us, about quality of output versus time versus output?
Thank you. Quite a lot to unpack there. Paula, as somebody who leads a London office and has probably seen some of those issues of management and of productivity, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I'm going to maybe pick one little area to go into and hope I answer the question. So I think it was a really astute point about where we've seen some of the biggest challenge around mental health, and it is absolutely those people who are responsible for and looking after other people. I would say that, and that is still there. I don't think it's quite as acute as it was, but there are absolutely some residual issues that we have in our business as a result of that. I don't think I think this, and this is an interesting area, isn't it? Because I think for the pandemic, if somebody had said to you, how many people are off work in your organisation due to mental health issues, you'd have looked at them a little bit, it wasn't talked about, and nobody certainly wanted to have that kind of badge of honour that's why they weren't at work today. So I think, to my mind, it's a compounded thing. Now you can talk about it. So how much is a direct result of COVID and how much of it was going on anyway? So I think there's a little bit of a challenge on that one. So I think to some extent it has eased, and I think what we've had feedback from the people within Arup is that enabling conversations and actually being quite open about it and encouraging a conversation has been really well received. How you change it overnight is really difficult, because I think the residual effects from the pandemic are still ongoing, and particularly with mental health issues, they don't tend to be solved overnight. It takes time. So support, encouraging talking about it, and putting in systems within our organisation that encourage people and say that it's okay actually to have a problem, and to be able to put your hand up and say, I'm not good. And to have the support of the organisation. I suspect that different organisations will respond to that scenario in different ways. So I don't think there's consistency, and that's maybe one of the biggest challenges.
But having those conversations in a more hybrid world becomes more difficult, because you don't have that non-verbal communication that you would have if you were in an office somewhere. And you might not see the micro changes in people, like their fatigue, their lessening of participation in conversations, their tidiness of coming in and out of the office. And that's where I think the hybrid working can become dangerous, because we miss those micro opportunities to notice people's lack of well-being, which are harder to pick up if you are working in a more hybrid environment.
And certainly one thing that we're kind of asking, we don't like to mandate. I think it's not necessarily the right approach at the moment. Other organisations do, without a shadow of a doubt. We're trying to encourage people to be in the office a couple of days a week. And and when you can see that somebody isn't coming in those couple of days a week, you're following up to find out why. And there are some people who did something crazy and now they're living in the Outer Hebrides, and that's quite a challenge for 2 days a week in London. But for most people, you've just got to really hunt out those guys or gals, people who are not coming in, because there might be an issue there you have to deal with.
Absolutely. I've got two hands up who are absolutely desperate to ask their questions, I can see, and we're out of time too. I'm going to take these two questions, get some responses, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. But question, lady over here in the blue, and the gentleman here with the glasses.
About the hybrid work and productivity. I think I'm a HR professional, by the way. I think whole employee journey during the pandemic due to hybrid working and remote working has been changed. So what organization used to do is to map out their employee journey to improve their productivity. And before the pandemic and during the pandemic, I was working for technology defense company, and they are the world's biggest defense and most successful defense company. And I was already working with flexible hours and hybrid working, and their productivity didn't have any problem. So I don't see hybrid working or remote working as a problem in terms of achieving hybrid productivity. And also on top of that, no one mentioned so far about the childcare cost. But if it wasn't remote working, I don't think I will be able to stay in the job market with my childcare cost. We're talking about 3 years ago. On top of that, I was earning good salary, and I was working one of the world's best defense company, and I'm an experienced HR professional. So unfortunately, this is the reality. So if organization force employees to go back to office, I think they will see decline in productivity, and you will see less women in the markets. And recently, one of my ex-colleagues, sadly, actually last week, she had to resign because she's been forced to go back to office, and she can't afford to go back to office full-time with the childcare and the traveling to London. This is sadly the reality, and any organization has to consider that.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
The infrastructure costs, and that includes transport and childcare and lots else besides, but is all part of this. Gentlemen in the glasses for our final question of the evening.
I'll be quick. There's a poor academic slippage. We're doing some work actually on the impact of hybrid working on low-income workers. And the question I wanted to ask is, are we in danger of creating a two-tier workforce here? There's a lot of talk about the good office and the good office from home. And I'm finding from the work that we're doing that a lot of the offices that lower paid workers are in are not good offices at all. They're struggling. And when I asked a little survey of public service workers, public service workers, and many of them were very keen to do home working, but were very, very worried about the pay, losing waiting, for instance, but also all the concerns about trying to do their job with two small children running around them in the back kitchen or in the bedroom. I mean, there's something here that I think needs to be grasped, particularly question for Kieran, really, away. Local authorities, politicians, national government, MPs, parliamentarians, to start looking at whether we need to start thinking much more thoroughly about what sort of regulation and legislation, statutory rights we need to protect people. As I say, the fear is that the group of workers that you were talking about were very much professional workers. I can see that, but you get a very, very different response when you talk to lower paid.
Absolutely. Kieran, I'm going to come to you in a second. This lady over here, let's see, I'm a sucker for the enthusiasm in the room for this conversation. One last, I think it might be a comment related to this, Paul's point.
It's actually a comment related to both of the last questions, which is one thing that hasn't come up, but was alluded to, is the gender question.
Yeah.
And when you look around at the audience here this evening, you've got quite a male-dominated audience. Now, do you actually know what ratio you might have live streaming this? Do you have any figures that show how many people will be doing it remotely and how many people are actually here? And does that have implications, whether for the workplace or out of workplace events like this? And the other question about the two-tier business is about public sector, private sector, because I walk past the Home Office practically every day, and my inner Rees-Mogg comes out because they have enormous picture windows, huge amount of lighting at my taxpayer expense, and there is almost nobody there, despite quite generous London waiting allowances. Now, they presumably are not there because their jobs are secure, and nobody's questioning anything about that. But I think that is possibly a two-tier issue.
Thank you, and I'll just use this opportunity to plug some research that I'm working on with the Central District Alliance. It's called Unbiased, and it is about the gender, the barriers to women in the workforce, which I think you might be interested in. But Kieran, please, over to you to just respond to all of those comments.
Well, I mean, look, they're really to the point of this, aren't they? So on the one hand, there is a real opportunity for a different model of working to enable people to look after their children, look after their older relatives, in a way that's much more compatible with life. And obviously we know it's predominantly women that are paying, very predominantly women that are doing that work right now, and it will reduce the inequality. On the other hand, we know that if you're in a big office in the centre of town, if you're the cleaner or the security guard, you can't work from home, and you have to pay to travel into work every day. We know that if you're living in a home that is overcrowded, and you're being asked to work at home, you can't work productively at home. Whereas if you're the director and you've got a nice suburban house on the edge of town, working at home is a very appealing prospect, and being able to go out and walk your dog at lunchtime and have all of your space and go into the office just when you have to want to go out for lunch with your friends is a completely different prospect. And in the process, you're becoming better off because you're paying less travel to go into central London. So the risks, it can go both ways, and it's really beholden in the first instance on employers to understand that. We're looking at that very hard as a council. We have all sorts of staff doing almost every kind of work. How do we address that innate inequality in this? But I do think ultimately there is going to be a role for government here, and you think about the very practical things, there has been a whole movement over 2 decades of addressing chronic back pain. This is dear to me right now because I did my back in gardening yesterday, so not by sitting at the desk, but of making sure that office spaces are well designed so people don't get back pain. Well, who's doing that when someone's sat at home? Who's paying for the chair that's a good chair? Who's making sure they've got a good working environment? No one. So there is a real role for government to step in some of those spaces to work out what is quality work. On the more optimistic end of the spectrum, actually this shift to decent, non-overcrowded office spaces that are themselves designed to be good places to work in can only be a positive thing, and is a real opportunity to make a shift back from a direction that was going the wrong way pre-pandemic.
Thank you, and I agree. Thank you all so much for coming and for all of your questions, and thank you very much to our panellists, to King's College London and to Central London Forward. I think it would be very interesting to revisit this in a year and see both in terms of how the economy is doing more generally, productivity and growth, but also how we've all settled into this new way of life, and how London has responded and our places have responded. So I hope to see you then. But in the meantime, there are canapes and drinks, and I think a lot of appetite for discussion as well, with lots of food for thought. So thank you very much, and thank you.
The study.
Notice how we were split for executives. There was definitely I didn't just clock it before coming up. I should have probably swapped before.
I don't know how. I actually have no idea how to do it.
Different sectors.